Welcome to the Business Summer Series. I'm Alicia Barry. In this program, we take a look back at some of the major economic stories of 2020, including a budget surplus in doubt as the coronavirus, fires and drought batter the bottom line. And more corona carnage. The ASX crashes 10% while the US slashes rates to zero and the RBA stands poised to print money. Also coming up, the RBA's $100 billion lever to get the economy moving again. Until 2020, the thing that helped shore up the federal government's claim to superior economic management was the budget surplus. 2020 was meant to be the year the Morrison government took the budget back to black. But as the economy faltered, the government's determination to deliver that surplus increased pressure on the RBA to slash interest rates. The twin disasters of the bushfires and an increasingly rampant coronavirus wave pushed Canberra to do more to support the economy, meaning that return to surplus was likely to prove elusive. Finance correspondent Philip Lasker filed this report in February.
It's a goal that's made heroes out of politicians.
We have budgeted in 1988-89 for a surplus of $5.5 billion.
We have achieved our goal. Our budget is now in surplus. We are back in the black. We are back on track.
And it's made other politicians look foolish.
We are coming back to surplus with an economy which is expected to outperform.
Of course we will balance the books. We will run a surplus in our first term and every term after that.
Last year, Josh Frydenberg channeled Peter Costello.
I announce that the budget is back in the black and Australia is back on track.
Even though the government's surplus quest pressured the Reserve Bank to slash interest rates to record lows, that quest is looking shakier by the week as the bushfires and coronavirus add to the fallout from the long-running trade war and drought. Now the Treasurer is rapidly backing away from his proud boast made less than 9 months ago, embracing a far less ambitious benchmark, a so-called balanced budget.
That's the economic term when the budget is either in surplus or deficit by less than $1 billion.
What we need is for the community to believe that governments are acting in their best interest. They are increasingly frustrated that governments are detached from their interest.
How are you?
I'm only shaking your hand if you give more funding to our RFS.
After floundering during the bushfires, the government has tapped into the public mood, where human suffering is now the priority.
It'd be nice to be in a surplus, but if it's a time that we have to spend money to help people out because they're in a hard times, well, that's the time we have to do it.
With surplus comes a lot of cuts to people that need it most.
If you need it for other things like we do now, we should spend the money.
And spend it they will. Economic growth has almost halved in a year, and it's expected to weaken further to the slowest rate in more than a decade because of the bushfires and coronavirus. Coinciding with the slowdown is the government's disappearing budget surplus, which shrank from a forecast $7.1 billion in May to $5 billion in December.
We already had been slipping a little bit behind what the MYEFO would have said to us, or what we should have been expecting in the first half of the financial year. So given that the second half is looking much worse than expected, I think it's going to be hard to get to that $5 billion.
The economy looks like getting weaker each quarter, and it could be going backwards right now in this March quarter.
Growth doesn't look as good, and therefore budget revenues don't look as good. At the same time, the government has had to spend more money to offset the impact of the bushfires.
While the coronavirus and the bushfires have hit economic growth, independent economist Carol Austin says the government's quest for a surplus may have left the economy more vulnerable.
We have a low unemployment, a relatively low unemployment rate, but a high underemployment rate. And that as a consequence, there is still scope for the government to supplement the demand generated by the private sector.
ANZ says it's likely government support or fiscal policy won't be enough to get the economy back on course.
We do expect that the Reserve Bank will eventually need to cut rates again, but clearly it needs to be packaged together with fiscal policy.
Who would have thought budget deficits could be so palatable? Certainly not Josh Frydenberg.
Before thoughts of a budget surplus went out the window, the government waited on the Reserve Bank to smash the glass for its emergency response to the virus. In March, the official cash rate was slashed by 25 basis points to a new historic low of 0.5%, the fourth cut in 10 months, and there was more to come. Global stock markets were once again riding high on central bank stimulus, while nervous consumers began stockpiling toilet paper and other essential items.
The empty shelves at this neighbourhood supermarket tell a story of coronavirus fear.
Things are out of stock from the warehouse level. We are trying to, particularly sanitizers. Sanitizers are too much in demand. Sanitizers, masks, they're out.
It's a small example of what's happening right across the country.
RBA cut 25 basis points as expected.
This broad economic threat has forced the Reserve Bank to cut rates, the first central bank in the developed world to do so since the virus outbreak. In its statement, it pointed out that the coronavirus is having a significant effect on the economy, that the uncertainty is likely to affect spending, that economic growth right now is likely to be noticeably weaker than expected, and that it's difficult to predict how large and long-lasting the effect will be.
Rate cuts are really in part designed to short-circuit that really poor confidence and the downward spiral in risk assets, which can feed through to the real economy.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison took the extraordinary step of virtually flagging a rate cut before it happened, pressuring lenders to pass it on.
On behalf of Australians, that if the bank had a move today, then I would expect they would do the right thing by those Australians who are looking to see any support that the Reserve Bank would be seeking to provide at this time for these reasons.
All four major lenders obliged, passing on the full 25 basis points, which means a monthly saving of $60 on a $400,000 standard variable loan. But savers will be worse off. The Prime Minister's comments left financial markets with the impression that the Reserve Bank could take even more drastic action. Now there's a lingering sense of disappointment, which the RBA probably didn't want. The RBA says it's prepared to cut rates again.
There's one more. Thereafter, we move into what we call the unconventional measures, should they be necessary.
But there was a clear message to the government to do more.
There is a very pointed reference to the government assisting areas most affected by the coronavirus.
It's unlikely the government needs any more convincing.
Soon after, markets started hemorrhaging money. The ASX plunged 10% in its biggest one-day drop on record. The US Federal Reserve promised emergency pandemic measures, slashing its interest rate by a full percentage point to nearly zero. At home, the Reserve Bank stood ready to pump billions of dollars into markets as the crisis unfolded and fear and uncertainty took hold.
Gloom is everywhere, not just in the trading rooms. Half Australia's finance industry is home alone. It doesn't matter. Sell-offs, once considered disastrous, are now routine.
What we're seeing is a huge amount of volatility and uncertainty in financial markets right across the globe.
Since it peaked at an all-time high last month, the ASX 200 index has plunged more than 30%, losing over $700 billion. Hot on the heels of a massive emergency rate cut from America's central bank, the Reserve Bank announced it's ready to take extraordinary action.
Policymakers are really throwing the kitchen sink at developments on the virus front, and yet markets, I think, still remain uneasy, and that's largely because while policy action will help, clearly there's still a great deal of uncertainty as to the spread of this virus, the extent and the depth.
In a statement, the RBA said the financial system is well placed to deal with the effects of the coronavirus, but it's expected to cut interest rates again as early as Thursday.
What we'll see is that final interest rate cut that we've been expecting for a while. We'll take their cash rate down to 0.25%. That's the point they've said is the low. It can't go any lower than that.
It also said it's ready to buy government bonds, which is another way of keeping interest rates down. This is part of a coordinated global effort to prop up the world economy, not just Australia. The next step may be to ease regulations on the banks so they could lend more. But is it the answer?
There's a lot being done on a number of fronts. What it will do is help ease liquidity concerns. It'll help pump credit into the system. It'll help lend some support to economies both here in Australia and globally.
I don't think the level of rates is a particular issue at the moment. It's more the lack of appetite to borrow, and in uncertain times it's very hard to shift that borrowing appetite in the direction you like to see. Where you probably will get a more useful reaction, though, I think, is in the currency.
A lower Australian dollar helps boost the economy because it makes our exports cheaper. Imports become more expensive, but in this environment, Australians aren't buying much beyond the bare essentials.
Australia's unblemished record of 3 decades of economic growth was envied the world over. The lucky country had always relied heavily on migrants deciding to call Australia home. But with international border closures stretching out for 12 months or more, what would happen to an economy left without the influx of people on which it so depends for growth? Daniel Ziffer filed this story.
Coronavirus has slowed migration to a trickle, but that hasn't stopped a torrent of debate from our political class about how many people come to Australia. But for those who've come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share.
Australia presents you with opportunity, and if you're hungry for the opportunity, you take it.
Born in Zimbabwe, Gracious Chithakwa is part of the migration surge that's powered the Australian economy. Her company arranges loans in Melbourne's booming western suburbs, where 550 people arrive each week.
Wyndham is represented or is home to about 13,500 businesses. And these are mainly represented by immigrants. So it will be interesting to see what the future looks like with any reduction in immigration.
Coronavirus is turning off the tap of new arrivals, jeopardising industries that rely on immigration.
With that tap turned off, how are we going to be, as a nation, as an economy, be able to deal with that reduced demand?
An astonishing 10% of our population flew here in the past decade. It's made Australia a multicultural marvel and far outstrips countries like the USA, Italy and Japan. But that huge growth has papered over the cracks in our economy. The recurring political debate about immigration tends to ignore the demand and employment that new communities create. But if you divide gross domestic product, the value of what we produce, by our population, productivity and living standards have been slipping. That's because states in the Commonwealth have taken the economic credit from population growth, but not spent the money to help our larger cities deal with it. We've benefited as a society and as an economy. The global financial crisis was 12 years ago. Without our immigration surge, we'd have gone into recession several times since then. It's one of the reasons demographers expect continued arrivals once flights resume.
I suspect we're headed for a nation-building scheme similar to that we experienced post-World War II. Australia will need to literally rebuild, build physically and socially.
And it was really just quite easy to keep that system ticking along. And now that system's been turned on its head, and we've got to ask ourselves, where we sit in the global economy, what's going to be the income generators over the next 5 or 10 years, and what is the sort of plan for Australia moving forward?
The new plan might be the same as the old one, inviting more people to share the Australian dream.
It gives us an equal footing, in other words. Like there's no one special. As long as you've got the skills and what it takes, opportunities are there.
Something we can all rejoice in.
Daniel Ziffer reporting in May. On what would normally be Budget Day, the Treasurer delivered a sobering COVID-19 update. A year after prematurely declaring the budget was headed back into black, the government was on track to deliver the biggest deficit in history.
Cafe owner Dave Moran is lucky. He still has a business to run. But the once thriving cafe and bar is closed. Selling takeaway food is the only lifeline.
It's going to be hard to know how we're looking in the long term, but for the short term, we're able to pay all our staff and pay our bills at the moment.
Turnover has plunged 35%, Half the staff of 27 have been let go, and those remaining are supported by JobKeeper payments.
So it's vital. Without it, we wouldn't be able to survive, that's for sure.
But survival isn't certain if after 6 months, as the economy improves, the government withdraws support at the same time as banks and landlords end their concessions.
The recovery will come, but it will be a challenge in part. And I think what that means is that governments, both at a state and federal level, will be backstopping the economy for some time to come.
Profit margins are thin, so without government support, survival depends on conditions returning to normal. As long as social distancing remains, this business's viability is threatened.
I'm imagining it's going to take at least 6 months to a year. I mean, probably even longer till we're back to normal.
It's why the federal government cannot contemplate withdrawing support too soon or too suddenly. Many businesses, their employees and the economy would be placed in peril.
If the timing wasn't right, that clearly would push the economy back into recession again. And you'd wonder, why did we spend all that money?
Government programs, which started in March, mean more than $120 billion has been spent to rescue the economy, 25% of GDP, and it's all scheduled to disappear almost as quickly as it arrived. That could spell disaster.
As we get closer and closer to the drop-dead date for those programs, consumers will be feeling increasingly nervous, and I think the government needs to go on the record and talk about how it is that we're going to transition off those programs in a way that doesn't really provide a significant shock to people's incomes and a shock to the economy.
Some expect the programs to be refocused from saving jobs to participation.
So getting people who are out of the labour market or unemployed back looking for work or reskilled. And I also think, a pretty successful go-to for Australia over the last decade or so has been infrastructure projects.
Even after the lockdown is largely ended, will people spend and will employees happily return to work?
The main thing to make sure is that the debt doesn't keep ballooning up. You basically have to stabilise. And as everybody knows, you can stabilise that debt with very low interest rates by getting growth and inflation up a bit.
This is a once in a generation, if not once in a century shock. We should be thinking about paying that debt down over decades, not years.
Adrian Blundell-Wignall says the government should abandon tax cut plans because the people who need it don't have much income. The priority should be cheap and easy finance for struggling small businesses and the jobs they support.
If they liquidate and they're gone, they're gone. They won't come back very easily. We'd be talking about a very long period of trying to get out of jail on this economy.
We've been here for 5 years and on paper run quite a successful business, but at the end of the day, there's not a lot of the pie left after it's all been cut up.
It won't be easy, whichever way you cut it.
Then it happened. An already slowing economy was slammed into reverse by the extraordinary events of bushfires, floods, and then the virus lockdowns. For businesses already reeling from a summer of disaster, the road out of recession loomed long.
Kylie Gemmell and her partner Trent Glass were living their dream in regional New South Wales. But that turned into a nightmare when their accommodation business was hit by the drought, then bushfires, and now the lockdown.
The tap was literally just turned off.
This year's income is zero.
As a business, it's definitely very worrying, and to be quite honest, I don't think that any business could have planned for the succession of disasters that we've had.
Treasurer Josh Frydenberg made the best of a bad situation.
What we were facing was an economist's version of Armageddon. We have avoided the economic fate and the health fate of other nations.
His argument appears to be that our recession's a bit better than the American recession, which doesn't really cut it for a lot of people who are worried about how they'll put food on the table.
From mid-March, the pandemic and lockdowns pushed the economy off a cliff. Spending on services like travel, accommodation and hospitality plunged, while people panic-bought food and groceries. The savings rate rose sharply. Australians were scared or simply unable to spend as the economy shut down. Business and housing investment was subdued, highlighting concerns about construction jobs. Supporting the economy was government spending, triggered by the support payments needed following the natural disasters and lockdown. Trade was also a positive because our exports proved more resilient than imports, which fell sharply because the economy was so weak. These numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. 600,000 people have been thrown out of work and a large part of the private sector is on its knees. It means government support will need to remain in place for some time to come.
Elevated debt levels, low productivity, weak wages, all of that's still there when we come out.
Clearly there is going to need to be some support that is ongoing. September is probably a point when we're expecting a second long wave of economic dislocation.
Kylie Gemmell is hoping the worst is over as restrictions are eased.
People were just desperate to get away. I think everyone was sick of being in lockdown, and our bookings have been strong.
What could possibly go wrong?
By September, it was beginning to look like the economy was on the mend. Inflation was up 1.6%, but that was off the previous quarter's collapse when childcare was free and petrol was super cheap. As Rachel Papazoni reports, the RBA was still warning of a long and uneven path ahead.
Should we maybe we should do it like this.
Free childcare might not have been good news for Australia's economy last quarter, but it was for the Holland family.
We could put some money towards our mortgaging, get in a more secure position, and we were able to go on a holiday with the family, which was nice.
Now that parents like Natalie are paying for childcare again, that money is flowing through the economy. And it showed up in today's inflation numbers, from a 95% drop in childcare spending in the June quarter to accounting for more than half of the 1.6% increase in spending this quarter, taking annual inflation to just 0.7%, way below the RBA's elusive 2 to 3% target.
Cool, how's that?
But it means families like the Hollands are now having to watch their finances closely again.
It's back to being tight as it was before, and we need to sort of count the pennies a bit more again.
While today's figures suggest the economy might be growing again, a lot of it is thanks to government support.
And I think there will be a lot of households that start to become more careful with their spending as government support winds down and the unemployment rate rises.
The RBA agrees. People are saving much more money, so less cash is being spent, which will keep inflation low. As petrol prices rose, so too did the amount of money we spent on it. After contracting almost 20% in June, it was one of the big growth areas this quarter, up more than 9%. Along with childcare, spending on preschool and primary school education also rose after it was no longer free in some states. And as we continue to stay at home, consumers again spent up big on furniture. In stark contrast with June's figures, all states posted growth for the quarter. Victoria had the slowest growth, but only just.
Some of that reflects the fact that childcare is still free in Melbourne, but also, of course, that people have been at home under those stage 4 restrictions, so not being able to go out to a restaurant, for example.
Now that Melburnians can start eating at a restaurant, its spending next quarter is expected to be more in line with the rest of Australia. But the RBA has warned Australia's economic recovery will be unpredictable and uneven, with the number of business insolvencies rising, while some households will struggle to pay off their debts. And while we're now back to inflation, it's incredibly weak, while almost 1 million Australians remain out of work. That's why the RBA is likely to announce more monetary policy easing on Tuesday.
By November, it was a sure bet the Reserve Bank was cutting rates again. The most stunning part of the RBA's announcement was its launch into quantitative easing. It's what we've seen the US and European central banks do since the GFC to stimulate their economies. The extraordinary measures came despite the RBA lifting its growth and employment forecasts. Rachel Papazoni again.
It's been almost a decade since interest rates were cut on Melbourne Cup Day, and never before has the Reserve Bank fronted the media after such a decision. But an extraordinary year requires an extraordinary response.
At its core,
Today's decision reflects the Reserve Bank Board's commitment to do what we reasonably can with the tools that we have to support the recovery of the Australian economy.
The bank has cut the cash rate from 0.25% to the new record low of 0.1%. And in moves still new in Australia, it's ramping up quantitative easing. That involves pumping $100 billion into the economy by buying government bonds. And it's also cutting the rate on cheap credit to the banks, which should lower borrowing costs for households and businesses.
Another aim for the RBA is also to lower the exchange rate. And the exchange rate, a lower exchange rate does make our exports more competitive, and that helps to lift economic activity as well.
Mark and Verity Reason's lender didn't pass on the full rate cuts in March, but they hope this time will be different.
I'll be looking either to negotiate a lower interest rate or looking to another lender.
They're banking on the extra saving after Verity was put on JobKeeper.
We could end up going back to one income, so to have a lower interest rate would be immensely helpful.
But while rate cuts are great for people with a loan, they're not for savers like Ankita Gangaramani.
It's really impacted me in terms of the amount of interest that I gain on the actual savings that I make. So my money isn't exactly growing.
She's seen her interest rate with one of the big four banks shrink since the start of the pandemic.
When I started on with them, it used to be a percentage, then it fell down to about 0.9%, and now it's falling even further.
She's now earning just 0.5% interest on her savings. While interest rate cuts are what consumers feel the most, it's the Reserve Bank's huge injection of cash that signals the pressure our economy is under. For more than a decade, it's refused to be drawn into a game of manipulating interest rates and the currency. But with rates cut to the bone, there's no alternative if we're to remain competitive in a global economy.
The RBA could certainly up its bond purchases. There are other policy measures available, potentially taking the cash rate into negative territory if needed. There certainly are options open to the RBA if they do think that the economy needs more stimulus.
Which means the history books could be rewritten again.
As the RBA has warned, there is a long and uneven recovery ahead. The business team will be bringing you those stories and more throughout summer, and you can head to our website and click on the business page. We look forward to bringing you more of the impact on business and the economy when the business program returns on February 1. I'm Alicia Barry. Thanks for watching.